is that as literally as like
we need a jingle, don't we?
Well, here we are. We are second show in. I'm doing the honors this time of starting us off. I'm Daniel Geey. I'm a partner at Sheridan's, if you guys didn't know, and I'm joined by Omar Chaudhry, who is Chief Intelligence Officer at 21st Club. Omar speaks sense. I add a little bit of law in if necessary. And today what we're going to be doing is talking about probably one of the most topical issues around at the moment, which is, I guess, generally football reform, but in particular, EFL Blue Sky Thinking, which is they're the 3 leagues below the Premier League. And this is almost as a result of a fantastic piece that Omar and one of his colleagues, Ben Marlow, has written in Sport Business over the last couple of weeks, I think, that I read with real interest over the weekend, and actually I say actually like it was a surprise, but I actually really enjoyed, because it wasn't the usual type of stereotypical thinking. It was really some blue sky thinking based on some real, detailed analytical critiques, really. So what I thought we'd try and do is, with obviously Omar's help, paint that picture and then talk about a few concepts that you sort of uncovered and wanted to sort of distill. So Omar, if maybe we try and just set things up, which was my understanding of your piece really was to try and firstly, I guess, work out why clubs were in such an insecure financial footing in the first place based on some revenue figures, and then understand why clubs keep falling into the same traps of overspending, etc., and then thinking about potential solutions to address those issues. You talked about media rights, spending restrictions, the purpose of a club, and competition formats. So obviously we won't go there just quite yet, but if you want to give us a bit of context, that'd be great.
Yeah, so I mean, we've all obviously seen some of the challenges that the EFL clubs have faced. There's reports almost every day at the moment around, clubs hitting the wall or nearly hitting the wall. We also obviously saw Macclesfield go out of business in September. Bury, pre-COVID went out, and I think there's a lovely line that my colleague Ben wrote in the piece, which was, clubs were already struggling, and COVID was the tide that went out and showed that a lot of the clubs were already swimming naked. And I think that has certainly been the case. And I think the number one thing that you note, I guess, is just the dependency on match day income that a lot of these clubs have. So, we've all been fortunate where we've been able to be at home in lockdown since June and been able to watch football. But that football's obviously been by and large, elite football, Premier League and Champions League football. The EFL clubs don't earn a lot through their broadcast monies. They earn a big chunk of their revenues through match day money, through ticket sales and people buying corporate boxes and buying food and drink on the day. So I think League Two clubs, it's up over 50% for a lot of them. Which anyone running a business, you lose 50% of your income, overnight, then you're going to run into trouble. So
it was crazy, Omar. If I can just briefly say, because I've just got the chart up, maybe we'll try and share it afterwards. And this isn't me knowing, this is me looking at the article at the same time, which was sort of match day went from 13% to the Premier League up until 53% for League Two, which is obviously incredible. That's one of the things you do in the piece, which is sort of compare lots of different things together. But it's incredible to think that, match day is so disproportionately important for the lower league clubs.
Yeah, it's everything really. And perversely in the Premier League, it's actually the big clubs who are most hit by the lack of match day. But yeah, in the EFL, it's so noticeable when these clubs have overall revenues, around 2 to kind of 6 million, if we talk about the tiers 3 and 4, League One, League Two. But the kind of most notable thing is that these clubs obviously aren't just struggling with match day revenue. There is a bit of a rat race really in the lower leagues because the prize at the top is so big. So an average Premier League club has a revenue of 250 million. Obviously the big six, typically in excess of 400 million. Bottom half Premier League, 150 odd million. And so even a League One club, when we think about all the clubs that have been in the Premier League over the last 10, 15 years, a lot of them have been in the lower leagues and League One, League Two. So Swansea immediately comes to mind, Hull, Bournemouth, Norwich, Southampton. You can reel them off. So it's not unrealistic. That's one of the great things about the English football pyramid, is that you can be a League One, League Two club and have real dreams of reaching the top flight. Whereas often, if you look at Spain, for example, the third tier there, Segunda B, is regional, and it's very flat structure. And a lot of those clubs, it's just very unlikely for them to reach the promised land. So you've got this kind of real incentive to do whatever you can to reach that top level as an EFL club.
And if we then sort of couch it in terms of then almost, which is one of the headlines, the piece that you wrote, which is sort of why are we here? A statistic from there's a great guy, Kieran Maguire on Twitter, and then also Swiss Ramble as well, that does some great financial figures. One of those figures that I saw a while back from Swiss Ramble was there were clubs in the Championship over the last few years whose wage to turnover ratio was almost at 200%, which is not sustainable in any way, shape or form. And that's what almost, your piece talks about, which is almost the misaligned incentives to get promotion, to reach the promised land. Yeah, exactly.
I mean, we all know that better footballers cost more money. So you're going to pay them more wages, you're going to pay the transfer fees, and you're going to get them in, and that's what drives that statistic. The trouble is not that number per se; it's the fact that everyone's doing it because everyone's got the incentive to overspend. So the leagues have tried to implement cost control measures, and we'll get onto that. But the fact is, when everyone has got the same prize, and there is the most obvious lever that you can pull is to just spend more money, what you end up having is revenues not growing, but costs just growing year on year.
And as a result of that, you see either what some people may say is completely rational spending, or what some people may say is completely irrational spending. The rational approach, I guess, would be, well, we need to get to the Premier League at all costs. Or we need to get to the Premier League at all costs, and we're willing to either breach regulations, to spend unsustainably, and to take that business gamble because it will effectively be, worthwhile to a degree. And that's why, depending on if there's anything you want to say there, that's why we saw over the summer, for example, salary caps being imposed at League One and League Two, and the implications, the spending implications for that, I guess.
Yeah. So on the other point, it is probably the most rational thing to do to break the law as a Championship club in particular, because if you have 300% wages to turnover, you're very likely to be promoted because you've obviously invested. If you've invested well, you've invested in good players, so you get promoted, and you leave the regulatory environment of the EFL and you're in the Premier League. And so, we have seen clubs do that, and again, the issue isn't just one club doing it; is that all the clubs see that incentive and all do it. So yeah, the salary cap measure is an interesting one. We had SCMP, I think it was, before this season, which was spending linked to revenue. So kind of like a soft cap.
Yeah.
I think you probably know better than me, Dan, but I think the big challenge of it was just monitoring it on an ongoing basis, because you didn't know what a club's revenue was going to be. They could therefore spend and spend and spend, and therefore you wouldn't necessarily know until the end of the season, until it was too late, where a club was at. And so that's why they've brought in this hard cap.
And also, it seems from the reports, though, from the press release, and I just recently did a blog on it that I'll put in the messages afterwards, is that there seems to be a more dynamic reporting mechanism for salary caps at League One and League Two. So if, just for summary's sake, the salary caps that have been imposed are hard caps of 2.5 million and 1.5 million respectively for League One and League Two. The way that it will effectively be enforced is that I believe if you spend it to 5% over those amounts, there will be some type of luxury tax capability or mechanism built in, but anything over that will lead to substantive disciplinary measures and regulatory breaches, etc. And and the definition of what actually is salary is pretty broad. So one of the pieces a couple of the reasons that you write in your piece is actually about why, potentially, at least anyway, a hard cap, because it just is a hard number rather than it relating to, for example, a percentage of turnover or otherwise, might be seen by some as being pretty restrictive.
Yeah, exactly. I think the issue with a hard cap is that it potentially limits an incentive to grow revenues, which ultimately clubs should be incentivized to grow their revenues, grow their club, grow sustainably, and rise the leagues through that mechanism. But when you impose a hard cap, then a kind of club towards the bottom end of League Two can spend as much as a club towards the top end of League Two, even though they might be wildly different. So the classic case at the moment is Sunderland, huge club, normal circumstances would have a lot bigger revenues than a club, towards the bottom end of League One, and therefore, why should they be restricted when they're actually capable of spending a sustainable amount at a certain revenue level? So it comes back, this kind of a governance piece really, but it comes back to kind of better reporting and tracking of spending and linking that to revenues. And we should be able to do that, frankly, in this day and age. Like, we've got access to technology and tools. 21st Club, we've developed some that enable clubs to kind of track spending in live. So really, I don't think there is any excuse not to have that soft cap.
And then two things I was just thinking about there, because I think something to look out for is, it's been reported that the championship clubs, sooner rather than later, might well be implementing some type of hard cap. It sounded like from some of the reporting that it just couldn't be agreed what that number potentially would be, if it's in the low the high teens rather, or anything more by way of numbers, and then how that relates to interaction with the Premier League, for example, by way of relegation and promotion. There is the profitability and sustainability regulations, which are currently in place between the Premier League and the Championship, and different amounts for when you move in between those leagues. So I think that's something to definitely be thinking about and considering. I think also, as you mentioned in the piece, that there's been a significant number of clubs, I guess if it's the right way of saying, gaming the system, which is looking for the potential loopholes, selling stadia to be able to raise revenue to effectively break even or not fall foul of the particular spending regulations. So there's certainly a query over whatever type of regulatory cost control landscape is in force or enforced, that there was always going to be those issues. Now, the thing that you quite interestingly state in the piece talks about how then do you realign incentives, and how do you do things potentially differently in order to think about the root causes of things rather than the consequences and the symptoms. And this is, I think, where you get into the really interesting points about some of the things from a blue sky thinking perspective.
Yeah, exactly. I think we need to. There's a few things to think about here. So there's firstly, can we grow championship value or EFL value in general? And I think the answer to that is yes. The EFL has a huge amount of value. You think about the clubs that have been in the EFL over the last kind of 10 years. Leeds European Cup winners, Aston Villa European Cup winners, Nottingham Forest European Cup winners, Blackburn Rovers Premier League winners. You've got a lot of big clubs in there that people want to watch, domestically and internationally. And so I think there's a feeling that the rights are probably slightly undervalued for the EFL, and therefore the clubs aren't necessarily realising the value that they deserve. So that's a kind of conversation to be had around how you can better kind of realise those rights, and realise the value in the league. And then there's kind of what is the purpose of EFL football, and particularly here, I think we should probably separate out Championship from League One, League Two, because as you get into League One, League Two, you're getting into clubs that don't have the global pull to the same degree, don't have European Cups or Premier League titles. They've got a slightly more kind of local feel to them, and I think there's this kind of culture within English football, which is a good thing, about it's all about winning, it's all about going to the next tier and so on. And I think ultimately unfortunately, for better or worse, that's not a healthy system for English football at the moment, because it leads to this unsustainable spending. So can we get clubs to rethink what they exist for? And the analogy, I think it made it into the piece, but the analogy I like to use is that, you know, when you start up a restaurant around some kind of shoddy corner, you know, not in the nicest part of town, your food's authentic, you know, it's made with love. You got the waiter who's the chef, who's the kind of dad, and everyone's kind of got this family environment. And you go there and you go to that restaurant, you have an unbelievable experience. The food is great and so on. But that restaurant doesn't aspire to be the next Nobel, the next Michelin star. It aspires to be what it is. And that, I think we call it kind of purveying the authentic football experience. And I think there's, you know, if we talk about, there's a lot of disillusionment with modern football in the top end of the game, then why can't the EFL really tap into that group of disillusioned fans, you know, that group of people who want that kind of authentic football experience? So, you know, there should be a lot more done to kind of allow those clubs to tap into their communities and let Premier League clubs have the global fan bases and so on, but let EFL clubs tap into that a lot more. And also kind of be a much kind of stronger part of the community. So again, no kind of obvious way of thinking about this, but if clubs are serving their communities very well, why not reward them with an FA Cup tie of their choice? You know, so you're, I don't know, Yeovil, you've done loads of work for your community, you've engaged loads of kids, you know, been out of schools, you've kind of done work to support people in the local area. You get first pick, so you can either go to Man United away if you want and have a payday, or you can choose to play, I don't know, a non-league team at home because you actually just want to get further in the cup. Like, it's totally your call. And look, that's not going to be necessarily a big enough incentive in itself, but there's enough that can be done there. And I know you've done a lot of kind of blue sky thinking as well on what are some of the ways that we can get clubs to kind of grow their revenues and think about the way that they exist in different ways.
Yeah, it's funny because we sort of beginning or middle of lockdown, along with one of my colleagues, Johnny, I did in the Sheridan's team, we tried to come up with a little bit of blue sky thinking on, and by the way, Omar, if there's particular questions you see, feel free to take a look as well. We came up with just a couple of ideas for how best to, you know, potentially deal with the types of financial issues that lower league EFL clubs were facing. Now, the interesting thing I find in sort of compare and contrast between your piece and my piece, yours being a lot better than mine for lots of different reasons, but mainly because what we were doing was thinking about the outcomes rather than the inputs. So we were thinking is based on the current system, which was probably flawed in some ways and also very good in others, what could be structurally done as a result. Whereas the thing that I find most fascinating about yours and Ben's piece is actually we need to think long and hard about a restructuring of the current status quo. So, for example, what Johnny and I were thinking about was, you know, a transfer tax or mandatory sell-ons, as you talk about as well, or, you know, a particular enshrined amount that Premier League clubs would have to spend in the lower leagues by way of credit, for example, or whatever else it might be. And I know Richard Masters was talking about that today to some degree, wasn't he? I think in the committee meetings that Greg Dyke was unfortunately involved in. But I think the important thing there is what you mentioned structurally about, I'm not sure if you want to go to that now, but if you want to, feel free to, which is you talking about how to make for a more regionalized League 1 and 2, which would then potentially feed into you know, more competitive and more trophy laden and a more exciting lower leagues. I know obviously this won't be for the traditionalists, far from it.
Yeah.
But the reason why we can't start thinking about these type of things at a time of quite significant structural change, or at least change.
So what Ben and I were thinking about was, well, how do you reduce this incentive to spend through sporting measures, for example? And one of the ways we were thinking about is, what if football was totally random? Then there wouldn't be this incentive to spend, right? Because it would just be, I'll let my club run as it runs, and then I'll let the results. If we get lucky, we get lucky, we go up. If we get unlucky, there's not much I can do to pull the levers. And the challenge with this, huge 46 game, 49 game with playoff season for EFL teams, is that there is an incentive just to spend more money because over the course of 46 games, you've got a better chance of finishing higher. Whereas cup competitions, no one spends loads of money thinking that they're going to win the FA Cup off the spending loads of money, right? You think, the cup, if I get drawn at City away, then I'll get drawn at City away. I can't really do much about it. So one of the ideas we came up with was a much more kind of regionalized, more random competition format with shorter group stages, because again, a short group stage means that there's fewer games. If you get a couple of bad results, then you end up going into a relegation tier as opposed to a promotion tier. Playoffs that encourage a lot more teams and therefore a more knockout based approach. And then the other piece as well is that regionalization tends to happen quite much higher up in other countries than it does in England. So in England, the first regional tier is the 6th tier. In Germany, it's 4th. In France, it's 3rd. In Italy, it's 3rd. And in Spain, it's 3rd, I think. I got that right. And so one of the reasons you have regional tiers in other countries is just simply to reduce costs. Because if Carlisle are playing, Plymouth, then that's a long old journey for the club, costs associated with it, for the fans as well. Away fans again are probably one of the most important parts of English football culture, and if away fans are having to do, that trip, I don't even know. That's probably like a 15-hour round trip or something like that by road. You're just not going to get the travelling support. Whereas if clubs are much more locally focused, you focus on derbies, you focus on kind of matches that have significance to local fans, and there's a lot of value on that.
No, I think that's a really interesting one. And so, maybe we can just start taking a few questions, because there's some good ones that have come in. Omar, can you scroll at all, or do you want me to?
No, I've seen it. I can't, but I can see a couple. So one of these, what would you guys recommend as possible reforms to FFP and profit and sustainability regulations in order to improve cash control and better club governance? Which, it's like earlier on I was kind of advocating, I guess, a version of FFP in EFL, in that it's linked to revenue. But there's a lot of criticisms of FFP as well, because in being linked to revenue, you're to a degree linking or tying in the status quo. So I understand that. But I think ultimately you need to create environments where clubs have the ability to grow their revenues, and therefore have a cap that's linked to that. I think hard caps just totally diminish the incentive to invest in stadia, invest in academy, invest in areas that are potentially revenue generating for the club in the long term.
There's a few bits also on there that I've seen working with various clients, reading the regulations and trying to understand and pick apart particular elements. Is there's differences between all of these regulations. So, for example, in the Premier League, you can actually spend over a 3-year period £105 million more than you earn if you put in extra amounts by way of escrow, bank guarantee, owner guaranteed amounts, for example. Whereas in the UEFA competitions, it's down to £30 million over a 3-year period, which is obviously pretty restrictive. Now, UEFA actually created a bit more flex in the system by allowing types of compliance plans where clubs could go to UEFA and say, we've got a new ownership group, we're thinking about spending on these amounts, and our aim within 3 or 4 years is to come within the spending requirements, and here's a pretty detailed conservative business plan. So there are definitely ways that different regulators have done it differently. And obviously, we talk about salary caps, none more so than in rugby, for example, which has been there for a significant amount of time, never mind MLS in lots of different ways, which is, tons of regulations on how clubs can control salary costs. There can be luxury tax, there can be players coming outside of the amounts, etc. So I think there's a lot of tools already there, and I think football can sometimes learn a lot from how other sports across lots of jurisdictions can do things too.
Yeah, definitely. And we're seeing, obviously, we spoke about it a bit well, we spoke at length last week with the American ownership model coming over. The American owners bring some things that a lot of fans don't like, but they do bring some things that a lot of fans should like, which is kind of sustainable business practices to European football. So I think there's a lot of merit in exploring those ideas.
There's a couple more questions. So Mazar, hi Mazar, how you doing? Asked a couple of questions. The one that Mazar mentions is, does a hard cap mean the possibility of misrepresentation of facts for bigger entities will lead to that? I'm not entirely sure what that means, but if for example, because there's a specific hard cap and going over that means pretty significant regulatory, financial, sporting consequences, then you only need to look to Saracens, for example, in rugby, of what happened when they were potentially or were paying players very big commercial salaries, or effectively partnering with players on particular investments, and that was seen as a way to circumvent the cap. And as a result of that, Saracens, obviously through another disciplinary case of disciplinary matter, actually were then relegated accordingly. So the interesting thing over the next few years, as we've seen with UEFA FFP, where some would have argued particular sanctions hasn't been as strongly meted out by way of bans or otherwise, is how the enforcement regime will actually work. And that's obviously something to think about. Whenever a regulatory framework is in place, sometimes you're only as good as your enforcement mechanisms. And I think that's obviously leads to incentive or disincentive to spend or not spend, really.
Yeah, the enforcement piece is really interesting, because you would think, like with some of the financial control measures that we have in the Championship, for example, it would disincentivize overspending, because there's sporting and financial punishments that come with it, and yet we still see clubs breach the regulations, and so you end up in this perverse scenario where owners are happy to breach regulations, and then they end up getting points deductions and fines and maybe getting relegated. The value of their club collapses, and you would think that'd be surely disincentive, incentive to stay within the regulations, but it just hasn't seemed to be the case. So there almost needs to be, as you say, a reimagination or proper thinking about the approach around enforcement and what is actually good for the club, good for the league, good for owners, whilst also disincentivizing bad behaviours.
Yep. We're coming up to a couple of minutes to go, Omar, but there's one actually question from Olivier, who's actually asked quite an interesting one, which is, if you implement a salary cap, it means the clubs would make higher revenues. I think what it means is potentially higher profits or less losses. How can you make sure the money goes back to the club and not into the pocket of the owner? It's an interesting way to frame the question, is the truth, bearing in mind that at least historically in European football and English football particularly, clubs have historically made losses in the vast majority of cases, only few outliers to that general rule. And with the onset of FFP, onset of cost control measures as well, that had generally gone from big loss-making entities to relative break-even. It's gone out slightly in the last season or so, where a couple more clubs have potentially made losses. But, ultimately, I think it's the other side of the coin, which is, if in years gone by, fans obviously want their owners and ownership groups to spend, but not necessarily at the cost of going into administration and possibly going out of business, like we've unfortunately seen. So if there was a toss-up between potentially making profit and burning through significant losses, I know what probably a lot of fans would prefer, who have certainly been burned by that. But at the same time, the question sometimes is whether owners take dividends, whether they're taking money out by way of other means, not necessarily by just making profit every season or otherwise.
Yeah, I guess the ultimate punishment is that if those profits aren't reinvested in the team, then you'd like to think that the team is punished from a sporting perspective, i.e. they're relegated. And that's the kind of tension you've got to kind of balance. In US sports, that's probably a criticism of ownership groups, right? Is that you actually don't have to do that much to make a profit, and because the cost controls are there, and it's all kind of sitting within this tight ecosystem, hopefully, European football presents those checks and balances, in that there is a real kind of meritocratic approach to deciding which teams are spending and investing their money well.
No, really good. Well, we're almost at 12:30. Thanks for quickly. Any other questions that you saw there, Omar, that was particularly?
No, they're all good, but I think we ticked off the main ones.
No, it's excellent. So yeah, we've done. I can say we're excellent, but I know you were excellent. I don't want to speak for anyone else, but really enjoyed that session as usual. So for everyone watching, any particular topics that you'd like us to discuss, we're completely open. We talk about it in a few days leading up, but if there's stuff, please feel free to contact us via Twitter, via email, via our social media channels, etc., and just ask for particular things for discussion, and we'd love to get a bit of input and feedback on stuff more generally. But as usual, thank you very much for joining us. The second edition will be on YouTube really soon. We'll post it. We're also going to be doing a podcast as well, which will go live hopefully soon as well. And see everybody next week, Tuesday, 7 p.m.